But for the B2C side, I think there's a bit of a fear around greenwashing, especially around externalizing your product carbon footprints when you don't have complete faith in what the numbers are and when those numbers are changing and evolving rapidly. What's your advice for towing the line between green shouting and green hushing?
Not everyone agrees with me when I say this, but an emissions number on a consumer product is more or less useless for almost every company. And the reason for this is the average consumer makes a purchase decision for an average product in about 9 seconds. Somewhere between 6 and I think 12 seconds is the data I've seen. In 9 seconds, the average consumer is not going to do the math problem. They are not going to say, okay, this is 0.62 kilos of emissions. What does that mean to me? Most consumers are not going to think that way. There are some situations where some referential data is helpful. And what I mean by referential data is this is 30% lower than the alternative, or some form of marketing around that can be helpful. That is usually helpful with a challenger play. So let's say you are an Oatly trying to displace a dairy milk product, for example, and then you kind of want to have the billboard and you want to say, look, here's our numbers, where are the numbers for dairy? And you're implicitly saying all of our products are better than all of these other products that we're challenging. You can see Upfield with some great plant-based products in their portfolio. They're trying to leverage the same challenger playbook for butter alternatives and spread alternatives to butter. And they're going out with like, here's what our numbers are. Like we're significantly lower than the comparables. That works as a challenger play because the incumbent is better known and more prevalent and is more likely a part of the grocery basket. It doesn't work if you're the incumbent because actually you have no one there to compete with. You are the incumbent, you might be fractionally better than other incumbents, but that's a much harder narrative to sell to a consumer in 9 seconds.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to State of Sustainability. We're going to get into the wild west of product carbon footprints today, discussing why they're useful, what are the best practices, what are the watch outs when building and using them. But before we get to that, I'm going to throw in a curveball and put Seth on the spot with a bit of a quiz on some of our ingredients that we have in our emission factor database and quiz him on which ones are the lowest and which ones are the highest. So hold on to your seats, hold on to your hats. Seth, hello.
Before we get into that, Izzy, I think 2 disclaimers. One is Izzy has not run these ingredients or quiz questions by me before, so there will be genuine surprise and I may get some things wrong. The second is we do, of course, reserve the right to post-edit the recording before it goes live. So whatever you hear will be a genuine response, unscripted, unprepared. You may not get all the outtakes of stuff that we missed or got wrong. We'll decide once we've completed the recording. Izzy, does that sound fair?
That sounds fair. And for all of our listeners who aren't watching this, you can see a slight sweat on Seth's forehead out of fear and nerves of this quiz that is about to take place. But I will be kind. So the premise of it is that I've taken a few emission factors from certain ingredients from our crop commodity database. This is actually a database that we've developed alongside academic institutions like Oxford University and Imperial to develop crop level emission factors. We've got about 12,000 across almost every single country in the world. So it is like an absolute gold mine to dig into. And I'm just going to give a shout out to Piers, who is our LCA expert, who helped me navigate this to find some juicy comparisons to pull out here. The database is basically emission factors with an overarching LCA framework, and we've used national level input data from like the FAO and allocated associated emissions of those inputs to specific crops using economic allocation. So that's how we've come to them. But I'm going to go into the quiz. So Seth, cheese. Out of these 3 cheese types, which do you think has the highest and maybe the lowest? It would be great if you could rank them 1, 2, 3 in terms of emissions. So we've got cow's cheese, goat's cheese, and ewe's cheese. Listeners, you can also note these down as well and put in your suggestions.
I'm going to go with cow's cheese as the most emissions intensive. I'm then going to go with ewe, and I'm then going to go with goat.
Okay, what's your reasoning?
My reasoning is that I think that a lot of goat's cheese comes from. I was gonna say something around the input intensity to get dairy milk versus goat's milk. But actually, like, I think there's a lot of variation depending on kind of how you're raising the cow, let's say, or how you're raising the goat. So you could have like a free range cow, I guess, or a free range goat, and I think that would radically alter this. So it depends, I guess. That's the answer. Is it sort of depends a little on context. Do you have more context for me?
I don't have more context, but I see where you're coming from, and I put my hands up and say I've given you a tough call here. But I also thought it was the same order as you, but actually, in fact, it's the opposite. So cow's milk is the lowest emitting. Then it goes goat's cheese, sorry, cow's cheese, then goat's cheese, and then ewe's cheese, so sheep's cheese, which is crazy. But apparently, according to Pierce, it's actually down to efficiencies. So there's a funny quirk where sheep versus cow, where actually leather and steak is worth more than wool or lamb's meat. So the emissions of the wider sheep production go to milk versus the cow. Hence you can see the like spike in the goat and the sheep's milk. There are also like there's another interesting point which is less relevant here, but with cheese, it's all down to the allocation of the cheese. So it's down to like the dry matter content. It's allocated down to the dry matter content. So a harder cheese will have a higher dry matter content, so there's more emissions allocated to it. So if you were comparing a Parmesan to a Brie or a Camembert, because Parmesan has a higher dry matter content, it's more emissions intensive, and that represents the amount of processing that goes into it, the time that it takes to age. And if you did it, for instance, by like just pure kilograms, it wouldn't actually be representing the amount of processing that goes into it. That was a bombshell for me. Seth, do you have any kind of thoughts or feelings off the back of that?
Actually, I think you've made me feel a lot better about myself, Izzy, because I think there is no way that my sort of random mental logic chain would have sussed out all of those aspects and details. I was already, in my defense, on top of the dry matter content aspect, because I remember looking at hard cheeses versus soft cheeses and emissions comparisons. But the actual allocation of how much emissions you'll allocate to leather versus milk, for example, this was beyond my ken. So I actually do feel better about myself.
But it's surprising because you think, okay, a cow, it's a bigger animal, it's takes up more space, whatever. But no, apparently not.
Well, the other question is how does used cheese make it onto the same shelf alongside your cow's milk and goat's milk cheese? Like I do not remember coming across used milk cheese.
So I'm going to try and pronounce the cheese, which is osso irriti cheese. I'm so sorry for all the fromage lovers out there for butchering that pronunciation, but apparently it's. But also manchego, is that not a sheep's cheese? Yeah, we'll have to put that out to our cheese board lovers. But onto maybe an ingredient that I don't have as many issues pronouncing: tomatoes. For this bit of the quiz, I'm actually going to test you on like geographical differences. So I've got two scenarios here. We've got a tomato from Kenya and a tomato from the United States. Obviously very different like climates, different areas of the world. Which one do you think has the lower emissions associated with it?
It depends, Izzy. It depends on whether this is a salad tomato or a ketchup or pulp tomato, for example, because you have very different ways of growing both of them. You see, here you've wandered into an area that I actually do know reasonably.
Okay, well, I don't have
Let
I
me
don't have the specification of
let me
type of tomato,
answer
but
let me
please
answer both
please tell me.
variations. I will answer both variations. So if you are looking at a salad tomato or a tomato that you're basically likely to be growing for the quality of the individual tomato, the look and feel, the shape, etc. And you're also trying to grow it so it's available in all seasons, you might be growing it in a greenhouse. If you look at the overall emissions footprint of a tomato grown in a greenhouse in a location like Kenya, where you have a much longer tomato growing season, and plentiful sunlight, versus, let's say, growing a tomato in the US or the Netherlands or many other locations where you have more dynamic seasonality. In those instances, you're likely using a lot of natural gas to warm a greenhouse in the, let's say, Netherlands or the US. And the gas intensity of that tomato growing process versus the natural sunlight and kind of long seasonality that you get in Kenya means that growing it in Kenya would be lower emissions intensive versus growing it in the US or in the Netherlands. You then layer on the logistics element as well, because you need to get it to location. But actually, the logistics of transporting that tomato is usually less in emissions intensity than the sheer amount of gas that you're pumping into these greenhouses to grow them in let's say, in a northern hemisphere market. That's on the salad tomato variety. On the sort of open field tomato growing, where you're growing this for pulp, you're probably therefore growing this in season at scale. And so you have, let's say, a comparable window maybe in Kenya versus North America, maybe not. But I would actually expect that. So in North America, you have multiple other advantages in growing open field versus greenhouses. In greenhouses, it's gas intensity, just having a playoff versus sunlight and natural conditions. Whereas in North America, on an open field basis, you have much larger acreage for the average farm. In a place like Kenya, it would be much more smallholder farming. You also have a lot more mechanization, and you have a lot more advanced inputs, fertilizer, pesticide, etc., and also advanced practices for using those inputs. So I would actually expect that on a per unit of output, an open field tomato farm in North America would be lower emissions significantly than the equivalent in Kenya. But I am open to you telling me I'm wrong on that, Izzy.
So I don't have obviously clarity on what kind of tomato that I'm talking about here, which for next time I will do that. But for this, and what's really cool about the database is that you can go into the emission factor and actually see the exact breakdown of this emission factor. So you can look at the things that you've just spoken about. So the yield per hectare, you can look at the logistics, you can look at the fuel and the diesel use. But for this one, what was really interesting and the main difference was actually the fertilizer use. So and because of that, actually the US had the higher emitting tomato than Kenya, by about 4 times. And this is because there was about 10 times more fertilizer applied in the US. But I think the correlation to make there was actually there were 3 times more tons per hectare of tomatoes used produced in the US. And this higher yield usually correlates, as you said, to higher emissions, because there are more fertilizers put onto GMO and whatnot to be able to create that yield. The other really interesting bit was the nitrous oxide that was released. So N2O is, according to Piers, 298 times more potent than CO2. And for the example that we use here, Kenya versus the US, there was 5 times more NO2 release. And this usually happens in wetter climates, because when you apply nitrogen fertilizer, it releases nitrous oxide, because of the bacteria and the microbes, and this makes the nitrogen available to plants through nitrification. But if the N2O is released when the soil is saturated with water, that basically means that the N2O is released into the atmosphere, and instead of converting it into nitrates, it's released. So there's a really tricky balance if you're in a wetter climate to actually balance the use of fertilizer levels. So when to apply more, when to apply less, by what is bioavailable. So that was a big skew that meant that the US tomato was a higher emitter one.
Oh, interesting. So you're actually contradicting me then, Izzy, because I was saying that I would expect open field tomato growing in the US to be lower emissions than Kenya because of mechanization and more sophisticated approaches to fertilizer and pesticide. What I was actually thinking anecdotally is that I believe most farmers in Kenya and most farmers also in Pakistan and India and regions I'm familiar with tend to sort of over fertilize when they fertilize because they are very risk averse and encouraged by the intermediary to apply more fertilizer to ensure that there's a yield. So that was kind of one factor that I expected to actually play out against the Kenyan tomato production.
That's interesting because I think what I got from this was that actually because fertilizer and pesticides are so expensive, that actually the usage is much lower in developing markets because of the higher costs associated with it.
There's another factor. Yeah, we could go on this. There's another factor that I don't know if you looked at. So I once built a model to try to look at tomato prices across Pakistan. I was briefly considering trying to have an arbitrage play in the tomato market. This is probably is even more detailed than you'd anticipated going into on tomatoes. But what I found was
one of your other lives.
one of my other lives. What I found was that you had lots of price spikes. You had basically two major price spikes at a national level in the tomato market in Pakistan, and I think this is true in many other markets. One was around the summer, so like a July spike when basically it's too hot to grow the stuff and too hot to kind of harvest, and so you just get a price spike. The other was around a winter spike, which was smaller, but still a spike. And then the other interesting thing I found was that you had lots of regional spikes as well, because you had an imperfect distribution of tomatoes to match market demand. And so you had lots of little regional price variations on any given day or month. And the other thing I kind of found as a result of this analysis was that in peak tomato production, in tomato growing locations, and there's a part of Pakistan that is a really good growing location for tomatoes, and I think it's similar in a part of Spain, and I think there are a few of these hubs where the conditions in a certain time of year are really ideal. The production was so high and the price was so low that it was not actually worth the shipping cost of getting the tomato to market. So it just made sense to let the tomato rot, basically, because there was no value to be had in getting the tomato to market. And I believe that would also be a very emissions intensive activity. I don't know what this festival is. I think it was in Spain where you kind of have like people running through the streets with tomatoes like thrown all, but like you can kind of see where the logic comes from, where it just doesn't, there's so plentiful supply, it doesn't make sense to actually even try and sell it because the economic cost of trying to sell it is not worth what you'd get for it.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting point. And also to develop on that is saying that like these emission factors don't sit still. So we were talking to Alan from Meadow, who was saying that it's been a really wet winter, which means that they have actually not been able to they haven't been able to produce enough, or they've had to feed their cattle straw and hay and grains, which basically has spiked up the price. And according to that spike, it also has meant the emission factors have gone up as more money has gone in and more like produce and inputs have gone into feeding these cows versus what it would be in like a kind of less wet winter where they could have gone out and be pasture fed earlier on, but because of the rains they had to be kept inside for another month or so. And so having to try and account for those like differences over time, like year on year, is also another big challenge to kind of get your head around. But on another note, Steph, have you been watching Jeremy Clarkson's Farm?
I have not. To be honest, I don't know what to make of Jeremy Clarkson in general. I was actually a big fan of Top Gear in the early days, and then like older Jeremy Clarkson seems to be very crabbity and generally unpleasant. But I've heard rave reviews about the Wild Farmed episode. And what's interesting is I also just saw lots of ads start popping up now marketing Wild Farmed products. So I'm definitely looking into watching at least that episode.
I mean, you should watch it. It is very funny, but I think it specific. What sparked my thought on this was what you were saying about the different price changes, and in that they're choosing different seeds to plant and different crop types to plant, and the market just fluctuates so much. Like we've seen, even like geopolitical issues with the conflict in Ukraine, like what that does to hike up the prices, and being able to navigate those prices as well, and like the effect that has on the emissions, I guess, is something we haven't really considered. But it's definitely interesting, and it really like gives you a good viewpoint on what it's like to actually be having to navigate these market shifts.
Yeah, I think there's also,
And you can get more of an opinion on Jeremy Clarkson.
well, I think there is something interesting also in just how agriculture responds to sustainability across the political spectrum and divide. And so if you think of agriculture as in many markets a right-leaning part of the political spectrum, and it has often been that way, I think, in the UK and also in the US. But what I'm hearing from industry is that many of the farms that they engage with are very open to regenerative agriculture, for example, as a practice. And the only thing they say is, look, we've no idea what the term means, but from what you're describing, it sounds like what we've been doing for a while now. And I think that there's something just interesting in actually, to become full circle politically and actually start playing into an agricultural narrative that has, always been, somewhat rooted, I guess, in practice versus other parts of the sustainability transition, like on the investment side, where actually there's a massive political backlash to ESG frameworks used in investment practices.
Yeah, and I think to our listeners, for another plug, is actually we did a really great podcast on regenerative agriculture and how that all looks with Audrey from McCain Foods. So definitely give that a listen to dig more into the kind of regenerative farming ecosystem. But for now, let's have a quick break. So now that you can have a bit of a breather, the quiz is over. So sit back and relax, Steph. It's all good. We are going to go on to product carbon footprints. So I'll just set the scene a little bit. For those who don't know what a product carbon footprint is, it is the total amount of CO2 associated with a product throughout its life cycle. It's usually one functional unit. So this could be a meal, a t-shirt, a kilogram of a product produced. And you can actually have different types of product carbon footprints. So you can have partial ones or complete. This is dependent on the scope of boundary. So whether it be cradle to grave or cradle to gate or gate to gate. I'll just caveat that a product carbon footprint is not an LCA. A product carbon footprint is part of an LCA, but it focuses on a single impact category, which is global warming potential. That's just measuring the potential GHGs released over a product's life cycle. An LCA measures the overall environmental performance of a product, including impacts such as eutrophication, acidification, ecotoxicity, etc., as well as global warming potential. I've listed out a few key challenges, and Steph, I'd then love to get your take on these challenges. But I think top of mind for me is that the product carbon footprint world is like super, super chaotic. There's an inconsistency in methods and standards used for calculating, so you can't really compare apples to apples. There's no standardized data exchange across technology solutions, and there's also a growing number of initiatives seeking to solve this issue, but that actually just cluttering it even more and making it harder for sustainability to professionals to actually navigate it. Steph, what are your take on these challenges? And from your experience, have you seen any trends emerging around these?
Yes. I mean, maybe let's start with trends. And so, in the beginning, or rather, let's say a year ago, companies were looking to engage their suppliers in gathering greenhouse gas inventories from the suppliers, and they were thinking about getting this sort of data from all their suppliers. So let's say you're a big business, like a McDonald's or a Coca-Cola or a Mars. You might be going out and kind of trying to get from 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 suppliers some element of overall corporate activity representation, like an emissions baseline, similar. And you're probably thinking about this as part of your responsible procurement practices. Um, this is maybe like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and we've started to see a transition in the last year or so. I think that what came out of that was a couple of things. One is that companies started to realize that actually most of their suppliers are irrelevant for moving the needle on their environmental programs. And so I was just on a call with one of the world's largest beverage companies. They're a household name pretty much in every kind of restaurant, for example. And for them, they have about 24,000 suppliers. And they found that there are about 70 suppliers, 70, that are meaningful for their environmental program out of those 24,000. So that's kind of one big learning, is actually a lot of these, frankly, doesn't really matter what the data tells you or doesn't tell you, because the contribution collectively is so low. The second piece is that companies, as they start to receive these greenhouse gas inventories or carbon baselines, start to realize that actually there was no relationship that they could infer from this corporate baseline of a supplier to a scope 3 of the business requesting the data, let alone to the product carbon footprint of a business requesting the data. So if I am asking, let's say 70 or 100 or 10,000 suppliers for their corporate baseline, need to find some way to convert that into the part that is entering my ecosystem. And the way that companies were historically doing that was an economic intensity. They were saying, okay, you're a business doing $1 billion of revenue. I'm buying $1 million worth of product. Therefore, I divide your overall emissions by 1,000, and I get the $1 million worth of emissions that is in my scope 3. But most large companies are migrating away from a spend-based scope 3 anyway to a weight and activity centric scope 3, whether it's because of flag or other standards, which means that the old ways of kind of matching this on economic intensity no longer make sense. So now that greenhouse gas inventory you're getting from your supplier is pretty useless. And so these are the sort of trends that have catalyzed progression towards asking for product carbon footprints. These are probably the big ones. I think there are a couple of accelerators. One is that if you're a B2C company, you're starting to either move into eco design of your products and thinking about how do you re-engineer the product, which means you want to have better primary data from your suppliers to represent the materials of theirs that you're using in your product. And or you're trying to get ahead of product labeling requirements because you expect that that's sometime coming in the future and you want to be advanced prepared and know how to react to that. If you're B2B, it's some of the same story around eco design, and it's also this bit around you want to be able to use sustainability in your pitch to your customers, and you want to include it in tenders, and you want to actually work with your customers to redesign products to be more sustainable. And so product carbon footprint is a good way for you to market the impact that you're able to deliver to your customer. So these are the trends that have kind of given rise to the frankly, now it's becoming a bit of an avalanche, oddly enough, of requests for product carbon footprints.
Can I jump in there, Steph, and just ask, you've spoken about this a little bit on your LinkedIn, but for the B2C side, I think there's a bit of a fear around greenwashing, especially around, externalizing your product carbon footprints when you don't have complete faith in what the numbers are and when those numbers are changing and evolving rapidly. What's your advice for navigating or towing the line between green shouting and green hushing?
Yeah, so not everyone agrees with me when I say this, but an emissions number on a consumer product is more or less useless for almost every company. And the reason for this is the average consumer makes a purchase decision for an average product in about 9 seconds. Somewhere between 6 and I think 12 seconds is the data I've seen. In 9 seconds, the average consumer is not going to do the math problem. They are not going to say, okay, this is 0.62 kilos of emissions. What does that mean to me? Most consumers are not going to think that way. There are some situations where some referential data is helpful. And what I mean by referential data is this is 30% lower than the alternative, or some form of marketing around that can be helpful. That is usually helpful with a challenger play. So let's say you are an Oatly trying to displace a dairy milk product, for example. And then you kind of want to have the billboard and you want to say, look, we are, here's our numbers, where are the numbers for dairy? and you're implicitly saying all of our products are better than all of these other products that we're challenging. You can see Upfield with some great plant-based products in their portfolio. They're trying to leverage the same challenger playbook for butter alternatives and spread alternatives to butter, and they're going out with like, here's what our numbers are, like we're significantly lower than the comparables. That works as a challenger play because the incumbent is better known and more prevalent and is more likely a part of the grocery basket. It doesn't work if you're the incumbent, because actually you have no one there to compete with. Like you are the incumbent, you might be fractionally better than other incumbents, but that's a much harder narrative to sell to a consumer in 9 seconds.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think we were at an event last week, and there was some conversations around that point about actually it doesn't matter necessarily what you do put on the pack. It's just having something on the pack can be a good indication that you are a good company or you are a good product.
Well, let's lean into this, Izzy, right? I think that in the consumer world, there are two plays here with sustainability data. I think one is the challenger play, which is where you're trying to capture a niche, a customer niche. And usually that customer niche is making decisions on the basis of identity. They want to actually try and, they want to buy plant-based products, and that's an identity-based choice that they've made. And they took more than 9 seconds to arrive at that. They may actually have spent months getting to this place where they now actually want this to be a filter on every consumer choice that they're making. And as a result, they can make the choice in 9 seconds because they've excluded a bunch of things. Kendall from our team, famously in our company is vegan and will avoid any non-vegan products. But that's because she's made the decision to be vegan, and now actually there's a very quick filter she can apply on any products that she wants to consume, which means she can still make a 9-second decision from a smaller palette of choices. And so the challenger play works well for an audience that is using some identity filter before going into market. There's another play, I think, which is what I'm calling the guilt-free purchase play, which is most of the rest of the consumer market that will factor sustainability into their decision making just wants to know that they're not a bad person by virtue of buying this product. And they want some simple heuristic through which they can still make a 9-second decision. And so the simple heuristic might be plastic packaging is bad. And so I'm just going to try and look for the product that seems to have less packaging, right? I might think glass is a more sustainable option. So if I see a glass, beverage bottle and a plastic beverage bottle, I might go for the glass one. Whether or not that's accurate or inaccurate, I've applied a simple heuristic, a simple proxy to still be able to make that decision in 9 seconds. Labels for most of the market function in that way. Labels act as an indicator that this product is guilt-free. You can feel better about yourself or less bad about yourself for picking this product. However, unsurprisingly, what you'd expect then is that in 9 seconds or so, the nature of the label doesn't matter much, because actually all labels are approximating the same thing. All labels are saying, hey, I feel as a product, I feel good enough about myself to brag about myself, and you should feel comfortable buying me as a product. And that's something that you can convey in 9 seconds, but it's not enough time for you to convey differentiation between labels. And so if you look at like the Nielsen IQ survey that came out last year or so, what it tells us is that actually most labels amount to the same thing when it comes to consumer preferences.
Yeah, and I think another interesting play is that at the moment, when you are, as a sustainability professional, you have maybe millions of or hundreds of thousands or thousands of different product lines, focusing on which ones make the most sense to have associated like label or like sustainability LCA or product carbon footprint associated with it. Joe from Sainsbury's had a really good example around regen beef, and actually like choosing your product line. Actually, sorry, I might cut this bit because I think we're under Chatham House rules, so maybe I can't actually say that. But okay, 3406. So choosing a product line that makes the most sense, because if you're going to try and put a product carbon footprint on beef or other really emissions intensive food, I'm not sure the market who will actually be looking for your like sustainability criteria will necessarily be looking for that label in itself. So being choosy at the moment about which products you want to prioritize to actually put through this process is also maybe another lens to add on to your considerations.
Yeah, I think that micro segmentation is important when you think about how to market sustainability. And so, what a lot of retailers are now thinking about is what is the sustainability branding that they can weave into their premium ranges, let's say. So, if you have, the upper end ranges of different retailers' offerings, can you weave in a regenerative component or a sort of sustainable practice component into the marketing and branding around that? And the implicit assumption is the market for this premium range is likely to be applying some of those filters where they want to buy products that look a certain way. They've already pre-programmed themselves to look for certain types of sustainability indicators, and so you are more likely to grab market share versus the other premium products on the range, many of which might be challengers, because many challengers do try and come in the consumer segment to tap in premium segment subsegments and then kind of expand from there.
Seth, you've kind of answered my next question for you, which is like, why are product carbon footprints useful? I think we've spoken quite well on the marketing and the claims front, but I'd love to dig into the R&D product design aspect of it. What are they looking for? Like, what are those teams looking for in terms of impact measurements, and what is the most helpful cheat sheet or data points that you can give to them to enable them to get on board and consider it as a worthy aspect?
Yeah, I think that the place to land is actually the same both in a B2C company, a consumer company, and a B2B company. And I think that is that you want to use product carbon footprints for reformulation and redesign of the product. And in the B2C environment, the reason you're doing that is because you cannot achieve your sustainability targets without actually redesigning the product, whether it's about using different types of materials in your supply chain, having a different structure, of the product, whether it's like lightweighting packaging, swapping out, let's say sugar for sweeteners, different variations. You need product level data and you need ingredient level data as an input into that product level data to be able to play around with these variations. So that use case is the central use case, I think, on the B2C side. I think the B2B use case is actually the same. And I think that the place we're in right now, where most B2B companies are looking to be able to generate this data primarily to share it as is, I think that's a transient use case. I think the more exciting use case is once I have a product carbon footprint for my ingredient that I'm selling to a B2C company, can I actually pitch counterfactuals to them? And can I say, this is what it is right now? I'm actually excited about creating this other variation, which I think will be better for you as my customer for achieving your goals. Let us now collaborate on a long-term R&D led, innovation led contract to create something new that has a demonstrably lower product carbon footprint. And I think that kind of R&D to R&D collaboration is what's quite exciting in the sustainability space. And if I were a B2B player, that is exactly like entirely what I would focus on. I would see sustainability as a massive commercial lever for me to expand longevity of contracts, expand share of wallet, expand margin, and create lots of exciting new IP.
And to get to that point, what preliminary work do you have to do to create, evidence the fact that this can be a low carbon option?
Yeah, I think that there's probably, let's say, three components of this, just to simplify it. I think someone was telling me that every podcast of ours has three things in some shape or form, but there's three components, I think, here. One is, I think, the data side and the data and tooling infrastructure. And obviously that's where we play in as altruistic. But it's how do I get the data from my existing systems and places? How do I tag and classify it appropriately? How do I process calculations and publish? How do I cut that in a way that's usable? That's the bread and butter of we do, but that's one part of the three parts. I think the second part is you have to have the actual potential to deliver something new So you have to be in some ways an R&D centric or an R&D led organization, or you have to have the ability to build that in. So if you look at, let's say, big, ingredient suppliers like ADM, Archer Daniel Midlands, redesign of ingredients is the bread and butter of their business. No pun intended, right? They are in the business of creating new formulations and new materials. We mentioned Meadow. Meadow is also has been going in that direction for a while. I think if all you're doing is buying stuff and slicing it and selling it on, the potential is a little more limited. Still there, but a little more limited. So you have to have the real ability to actually generate something new through R&D. That's the second piece, and I think the third piece is the capabilities commercially to engage a customer in a collaborative discussion around a long-term journey, which means your commercial team is moving from a world where they are selling a product on the basis of price, quality, timing, volume, towards selling a product on the basis of some sustainability credentials as well, many of which might be 2 or 3 years down the road in terms of delivery. And so there's the ability to sell innovation, and sustainability led innovation, I think, is a muscle that companies have to lean in on.
And just to lean in on the tooling piece, I think a common pain point is the price. The price of doing an LCA for each experiment, or changing like minutiae kind of parts of your product, and then having to do a whole new LCA at great expense isn't a scalable option if you're trying to do this across like a huge product range. So having a tool which you can do this like at low cost with relative ease, I think is really important.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is we're moving from, like, say, old world to new world here, really, where 2 years ago, if you were going to get an LCA done, you'd basically be going to an academic institution or a research outfit or a consultancy that functions like an academic research outfit. And there would be a cost for that research, which would typically take months to sort of develop and produce. And that cost would, it's not like anyone was making huge amounts of money on that, but it's a high cost. If you look at the new world where companies like us are able to do this at scale, like I would say in the case of Altruistic, we can probably do this at like 10%, 5% of the price point of an LCA at scale, or less, frankly, even fractions of a percentage point at a certain scale. But that's just by virtue of setting up as a software company where you can actually ingest data in bulk and process data in bulk as well. I think that's the direction of travel in this space.
And also make sure that your product carbon footprints match your corporate footprints, because having a bit of a discrepancy there can also cause issues. I know we're at time, but I just want to quickly ask you one more thing, and this is on standardization. I think there's quite a few, as we mentioned at the start, it's super chaotic. There are lots of standards, there are lots of that you can align to, lots of different ways of streamlining your data, lots of ways of putting your product carbon footprints. Have you seen any interesting solutions out there that are that you think like that's your big bet that you think can help kind of cut through this noise?
Yeah, I mean, so for us, we're a research intensive organization, and so we're always looking for what's out there. At the same time, we're a very customer led organization, so we tend to follow what our customers like and look for. We've talked about the WBCSD Pact Coalition a few times before. That's the standard that we think makes the most sense. It governs how PCFs are generated within an organization and how PCFs are shared across organizational boundaries. There are lots of add-ons onto that framework to make it specific and usable for different industries as well. So like the TFS framework for chemicals and similar sectors as well adapts PACT to be used in those areas. So that's the standard that we think makes the most sense. But the reason that we think so is also because it's the standard adopted by Unilever, P&G, AB InBev, many others. And so we're kind of just following the customer trajectory on that. I do think that if you're sitting in a consumer value chain, and that means that either you're a brand or you're supplying a consumer brand, then I would say it doesn't make sense to reinvent the wheel. And I would just kind of look to align with the same standard. I think that where you'll probably get to is that most software players that scale in this space, and of course we see ourselves as one of them, will probably be conformant with multiple approaches. But I think there are only so many approaches that you can be conformant with. And so we definitely see the pact framework as the one that we're most excited about.
Thanks, Seth. That's really interesting. Are there any other bits that you want to, or any insights that you want to share before we wrap up?
I think that there are still a lot of companies that are looking to solve for data requests that are coming in on a case by case basis. And I think that companies need to be able to take a step back and appreciate that the load here is only going to get bigger. And, so for example, I see, we were speaking with a restaurant chain the other day that is asking their suppliers to share product carbon footprints. When we speak with some of the suppliers, what we find is that the suppliers are looking at solving this on a request by request basis. So they're thinking, okay, this restaurant group has asked me for PCFs for these products that I'm selling them. Let me try and find some solution that can solve for this. Right now, no one else is asking me for this, so let me kind of wait till the next request comes my way and then I'll solve for that. And I think that that ends up probably becoming much more expensive and much less strategically valuable for the company to kind of do it that way. I would probably just take a step back. I wouldn't take a 10-year horizon, but even take a 3-year horizon and say, what am I likely to need from a data perspective based on some use cases? One use case is, can I just chuck the numbers back over the fence because a customer is asking me for it? Another use case is actually, if I have to get the numbers to chuck over the fence, what could I do with those numbers in my own business? And I think that enables you to actually get more value out of this rather than just kind of playing defense.
Definitely. I like those two use cases. We are going to be running a webinar on this topic because lots of people have been talking about it and asking us questions. So keep a beady eye out for that. Thank you so much, Seth, as always. That was fun. And maybe next time we can dig into the other ingredients of a classic sandwich to see where those emissions factors lie. Awesome. Goodbye.
Thanks, Izzy.